The cold breath of dawn swept across the Normandy coastline, and Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood motionless in the dim light, his fingers wrapped around a pair of heavy Zeiss binoculars. The English Channel stretched before him like a sheet of hammered pewter, grey and restless beneath a veil of coastal fog that clung to everything, muffling sound, softening edges, turning the world into something unreal. The air tasted of salt and damp earth, that particular blend of ocean and farmland that had become the only constant in his life these past months. It was just after 5 in the morning, and the watch had begun like every other. Routine and tired, another day of waiting for something that might never come. But then the horizon shifted, through the glass, as the first pale ghost of sunlight tried to break through the mist. Richter saw it, a shadow where there should have been nothing. A dark smudge forming at the far edge of vision, where grey water met grey sky. He blinked, adjusted the focus, and felt his chest tighten. The shadow wasn't fading. It was growing, sharpening, multiplying into distinct shapes that stretched left and right as far as his lenses could sweep. This wasn't a patrol. It wasn't a weather front playing tricks on tired eyes. It was something that shouldn't exist, something impossible. A city of iron was sailing toward him out of the morning fog, a floating fortress of steel and intent that seemed to bend the very curve of the earth. At that instant, before a single Allied boot touched French sand, before the names Omaha and Utah would be carved into history books, Klaus Richter understood with absolute certainty that the Reich he'd sworn to defend was about to be swallowed whole. To truly grasp the shock of what unfolded that morning, you have to step inside the mind of a German soldier standing guard along Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the frozen fjords of Norway all the way down to the Spanish frontier, German engineers had poured concrete and steel into the earth, building what they called the Atlantic Wall, a defensive barrier that stretched for thousands of miles, bristling with artillery, machine gun nests, minefields and tank traps. In the minds of the High Command, and in the endless stream of propaganda that flowed to the front, it was proof of German invincibility, an impenetrable shield that would break any invasion attempt like waves against a cliff. But Klaus Richter wasn't a believer in slogans. At 32 years old, he was a professional soldier, a veteran who'd survived the nightmare of the Eastern Front, and he'd learned the hard way to see through the layers of myth and recognize cold reality. He was old enough to remember a Germany before the war, young enough to have been forged and hardened in its fires, and experienced enough to be pragmatic, observant, and profoundly tired. His command was an artillery battery positioned a few miles inland from the beaches. 6 heavy Czech-made cannons nested in thick concrete casements, their barrels aimed eternally at the sea. From his observation post, a reinforced bunker sunk deep into a high bluff overlooking the water, Richter had a commanding view of the entire coastline. Day after day, he and his gun crews drilled, calculated firing solutions, cleaned and maintained their weapons, and stared out at that empty gray expanse, waiting for the invasion everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict. They called it Der Tag, the day. And the endless speculation about when and where it would strike had become a kind of maddening background noise to daily life. German intelligence was absolutely convinced the main Allied assault would come at Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, barely 20 miles of open water separating France from England. It was the logical choice, the sensible choice, and that's exactly where the bulk of German strength sat waiting. The entire 15th Army positioned and ready. Normandy, by contrast, was considered a backwater, maybe a location for a diversionary feint, but certainly not the site of the real attack. This catastrophic miscalculation wasn't an accident. It was the result of a brilliantly orchestrated Allied deception operation called Fortitude, a web of fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and false intelligence that convinced German commanders to look in all the wrong places. And it left Richter's section of the coast dangerously thin, stretched beyond reason, defended by units that were shadows of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. Richter's division, the 352nd Infantry, was better trained than most units in Normandy, but it was still a patchwork formation, a mix of hardened Eastern Front survivors like himself, and a much larger number of very young conscripts barely out of school, and older reservists pulled from retirement. They were brave men, dutiful men, but they weren't the unstoppable stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders asked to hold a line that stretched impossibly far with resources that never seemed adequate. The Atlantic Wall itself, for all the propaganda celebrating its strength, was more illusion than substance. Many bunkers stood unfinished, half-built concrete shells without roofs or adequate firing positions. Minefields had gaps wide enough to drive trucks through. The sheer distances between strong points meant that even the most heavily fortified position could be isolated, cut off, and destroyed piecemeal. Richter saw these weaknesses every day. The shortcuts that local farmers still used through supposedly secure zones, the blind spots and overlapping fields of fire, the places where a determined enemy could slip through if they had the will and the numbers. He carried a professional skepticism about their chances if the Allies ever came in force, a quiet doubt he kept mostly to himself. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension along the coast had become a living presence, something you could taste in the air. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving the coastal defenses, had been a whirlwind of energy and urgency, driving his men hard, ordering millions of additional mines laid, thousands of steel obstacles planted in the tidal zones, jagged underwater hedgehogs and stakes designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The soldiers called them Rommel's asparagus, a dark joke about the spikes rising from the sand. Rommel understood something that the comfortable strategists back in Berlin seemed unable or unwilling to grasp. If the Allies weren't destroyed on the beaches in the first 24 hours, if they got a foothold and consolidated it, the war in the West was finished. Allied air superiority would shred any German reinforcements trying to move toward the coast in daylight. And without those reinforcements, the thin coastal crust would crack and crumble. The first day was everything. The only day that truly mattered, and Rommel knew it in his bones. Then on June 5th, the weather turned violent. A powerful storm system blew in from the Atlantic, bringing high winds, heavy rain, and seas so rough that any amphibious operation seemed impossible. The German Meteorological Service, confident in their data, predicted the storm would last for days, maybe a week. This forecast allowed the entire command structure to relax. Senior officers stood down alerts. Some even left their posts for brief periods of leave. Rommel himself wasn't even in France on the night of June 5th. He'd traveled back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced the storm would buy them time. So when Klaus Richter took his position in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, the atmosphere was routine, almost sleepy. The storm had passed during the night, but the sea was still choppy and gray. The kind of conditions that kept everyone certain nothing would happen for at least another few days. Richter was scanning the eastern horizon, not really expecting anything, when something caught his eye. Just a flicker of movement at the very edge of vision. He raised his binoculars and focused, and his heart, which had been beating in the slow, steady rhythm of a boring night watch, suddenly hammered against his ribs, like it was trying to escape his chest. It wasn't a flicker, it was ships, and not just a few patrol boats or a reconnaissance group. It was hundreds of them, massive dark silhouettes emerging from the thinning fog. And behind them, more and still more. He swept the binoculars, left, then right, and everywhere he looked, the pattern repeated, an endless procession of vessels filling the channel from horizon to horizon. The sea itself seemed to have transformed into something solid, a dark, unbroken mass of steel and purpose. A cold dread crept up his spine and settled in his gut. The feeling of a man suddenly confronting a math problem so vast it couldn't be solved, an equation with no answer except catastrophe. For a long, frozen moment, Richter simply couldn't process what he was seeing. The sheer scale of it was an insult to reason, an assault on logic itself. German intelligence had estimated that the Allies might be able to assemble perhaps 3,000 vessels for an invasion. And even that projection had seemed wildly optimistic, an upper bound that assumed maximum effort and perfect coordination. What Richter was staring at through his trembling binoculars was something from another universe entirely. He tried to count them, but it was a fool's task, impossible. His mind kept losing track, starting over, failing again. On instinct, his tactical training kicked in, and he began trying to categorize what he saw. He could make out the massive hulking forms of battleships and heavy cruisers, their superstructures rising like small buildings from the water. He saw swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling the larger ships like wolves protecting a pack. And then there were the others, the truly countless others, landing craft of every conceivable size and shape, packed so densely in the water they looked like iron filings drawn by some enormous magnet toward the French coast. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes with the back of one hand, raised the binoculars again, praying he'd been hallucinating. But the image didn't waver. It only grew sharper and more terrifying as the sun continued its slow climb and burned away the last wisps of fog. The official count, verified later through exhaustive Allied records, would total nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada drawn from 8 different nations. The largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled in human history, a record that still stands today. But to Klaus Richter, standing in his concrete bunker with cold sweat running down his back, it wasn't a statistic or a historical footnote. It was a physical presence so overwhelming it seemed to warp reality around it. A declaration of industrial might so immense that everything he'd ever learned about warfare, every tactical principle, every strategic doctrine, was rendered instantly obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete and steel. The Allies had responded by constructing a bridge made of ships, and they were crossing it right now. He grabbed the field telephone mounted on the bunker wall, his hand slick with sweat, and cranked the handle hard. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4, he said, trying to keep his voice steady and failing. "I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end sounded tired, bored, dismissive. "We're getting scattered reports of possible naval activity. Oberleutnant, probably a small raiding party. Stand by for further instructions." "No!" Richter's voice rose despite his best efforts. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It's thousands of them. The entire sea is covered from one horizon to the other. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a pause on the line, a silence filled with disbelief and irritation. "Oberleutnant, the sea conditions have been evaluated. Our meteorological reports clearly indicate that large-scale operations are not feasible. Perhaps you should double-check your observations." Richter actually shouted into the phone, his voice cracking with urgency and disbelief. "I am looking directly at it with my own eyes. There are thousands of ships out there. For God's sake, send someone up here to look at the sea." He slammed the receiver down in frustration, his hands shaking. The fleet was too large to be believed, too impossible to fit inside the mental frameworks his superiors were working from, so they simply refused to accept it. He tried another line, this time reaching his regimental commander directly. "Richter here, sir. The invasion fleet has arrived. I estimate at least 10,000 vessels." He knew he was exaggerating. His brain couldn't accurately count what he was seeing. But in that moment, the number felt like an understatement, an attempt to communicate something fundamentally incommunicable. The Major's voice came back, skeptical but at least willing to listen. "Richter, are you absolutely certain the weather reports?" "Sir," Richter interrupted. "The weather is clear enough that I can see the end of the world sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire immediately." This time the urgency cut through. But even as the order began working its way up the chain of command, Richter could sense the paralysis at higher levels. Their plans, their intelligence assessments, their carefully prepared scenarios, all of it was being erased by a reality floating just a few miles offshore that nobody had imagined possible. While Richter was staring at the fleet, German High Command was focused inland on reports of paratroopers dropping during the night, assuming those airborne forces were the main event. A raid in force, perhaps. Maybe even the long-expected diversion before the real attack at Calais. No one was looking at the sea. No one was prepared for what the sea had brought. Richter didn't wait for the bureaucracy to catch up with reality. He turned and shouted orders to his gun crews, men who'd been roused by the commotion and now stood frozen at their positions, staring out toward the water with faces that showed a mixture of raw terror and awestruck disbelief. They saw what he saw. They understood in their guts, even if their minds refused to accept it. The drills were over. The waiting was done. This was real. Heavy shells were hauled up from the underground magazines, each one weighing as much as a man. Rangefinders began calling out distances that seemed impossibly large, numbers that pushed the guns to the very limits of their effective range. The massive barrels, silent for so many months of waiting, elevated slowly with hydraulic precision, their noses tilting upward to point at the impossible fleet gathering offshore. Richter stood at his post, binoculars pressed so hard to his face they left marks, watching the landing craft begin to organize into assault waves, watching the smaller vessels peel away from the main body and head toward the beaches. He could feel it in the air now, a low vibration, a deep hum composed of thousands of engines running simultaneously. The sound of industrial civilization breathing, the sound of a superpower preparing to exhale violence. The order finally came through just before 6 in the morning. Engage targets at will. For Richter, it was almost a relief. The paralysis of disbelief broken by the familiar clarity of action, the comfort of having something concrete to do, even if it was utterly futile. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone circuit that connected his observation post to the gun positions. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first cannon fired, a deep, concussive boom that shook dust from the concrete ceiling. Then a second gun, then a third, the crews settling into their practiced rhythm. The shells screamed out over the water in high, arcing trajectories. Richter tracked them through his binoculars, feeling a surge of professional pride mixed with nauseating dread. He saw towering plumes of white water erupt among the distant ships, near misses. His men were good. They adjusted quickly, correcting elevation and deflection, firing with disciplined precision. And for a brief moment, they drew blood. Richter saw a direct hit on what he later learned was an American destroyer, the USS Corrie. A flash of orange fire and a billow of black smoke erupting from her midsection. The ship listed hard to one side, wounded and would later sink, though some accounts suggest she may have also struck a mine in addition to taking artillery fire. From Richter's perspective in that moment, his guns had struck first, had proven they could fight back. A ragged cheer went up from the gun crews, a brief moment of triumph. A feeling that maybe their training and their courage still mattered, that maybe they could actually contest this landing. But the feeling lasted only minutes, because after the Corrie was hit, the fleet didn't scatter, didn't slow, didn't even hesitate. The gap in the formation was simply filled by another ship moving up from behind, and the endless procession continued without pause, an iron tide flowing forward with mechanical inevitability. Richter's guns fired again and again, the crews working themselves into exhaustion. But for every ship they might damage or harass, 100 more sailed past untouched, indifferent to the resistance. Richter felt a profound and terrible sense of futility settle over him, like a physical weight. He was a man with a teacup trying to bail out the ocean, a single voice screaming into a hurricane. He forced himself to look past his own shell impacts and take in the larger picture developing before him. The Allied battleships, massive warships like USS Texas and HMS Warspite, were now turning their main batteries toward the shore. 14-inch and 15-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car. And then the reply came. It started as a distant rumble, rolling across the water, growing louder, and Richter saw flashes of light rippling along the hulls of the big ships, like a silent lightning storm flickering on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart, the world erupting in violence so intense it seemed to unmake reality itself. The ground heaved and bucked beneath his feet, massive geysers of earth and rock erupting from the fields behind the beach. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun, and it was more terrible than anything he'd imagined. Where was the German response? Where were the promised armored divisions? Where were the fighter squadrons that were supposed to contest the skies? Richter scanned upward and saw nothing but Allied aircraft. An endless stream of fighters and bombers and transport planes. They owned the sky completely, utterly without challenge. German doctrine called for immediate armored counterattacks to throw any landing back into the sea before it could consolidate. But the closest tank unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was frozen by confusion and the rigid command structure that required direct authorization from Hitler's headquarters before making any major move. When the panzers finally did begin rolling toward the coast hours later, they moved without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and they were systematically shredded before most of them even reached the battlefield. It was in that moment, with his own guns still firing and the sky raining steel and high explosive, that Klaus Richter understood with absolute clarity that this wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. It was an extermination, a process, a conveyor belt of men and machinery that seemed capable of running forever, without pause. The Allies would land approximately 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. By nightfall, they would have over 150,000 men ashore across 5 beach sectors. The battle for the beaches was still raging. Men were still dying. But the outcome had already been decided. It was just a matter of time and tonnage now. Just mathematics, grinding toward their inevitable conclusion. The war in Normandy would drag on for another 2 brutal months. The fighting in the dense hedgerow country of the Norman bocage would prove costly and difficult. But strategically, it would change nothing. The fundamental equation had already been solved on June 6th. Every German tank destroyed was a permanent loss that couldn't be replaced with Germany's crippled industrial base. Every Allied tank knocked out was replaced by 3 more within days. Every German soldier who fell left a gap in the line that grew wider and more dangerous, while Allied replacements flowed across the channel in an endless stream. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war was just an epilogue to a story that had already ended. They would fight on, driven by duty, by fear of capture, by a disconnected sense of patriotism, or simply by the momentum of military discipline. But the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the dawn light of June 6, 1944, burned away by the sight of a fleet that filled the horizon. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, grinding collapse. Months of retreat and defeat culminating in the apocalyptic battle for Berlin. But for the men standing watch on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they looked out and saw a fleet so vast it seemed to cover the sea itself, saw a sky black with enemy aircraft, and understood they were facing not just an army, but the full crushing weight of modern industrial civilization turned toward a single purpose: their destruction. It was a new kind of warfare, one decided not in the hearts of brave soldiers or the genius of brilliant generals, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away, in the foundries and shipyards and aircraft plants of nations with populations and resources that dwarfed Germany's capacity to respond. And for one German officer standing in a concrete bunker with binoculars pressed to his face, watching a sea that had transformed into solid steel, it was the morning he knew with absolute certainty that everything was already lost. The morning he watched the future arrive on a tide of ships and understood there was nothing left to do but wait for the end.